Okay. Hello, hello. I am back. I'm still alive, even though I did not stream yesterday. Um, so yeah, we're gonna do this again. I think today and maybe weekend days I'm gonna be a little bit less news focused and a little bit more history slash education focused. Is kind of my thought. That's I think that it might just switch things up a little bit and uh, I don't know. Sometimes I don't really want to do just full news commentary or react stuff and just want to I still got to learn shit too. So you guys have to suffer with me. Let's see. Personal news. I did not stream yesterday. I Let's see. Yesterday, I don't think I did a. Well, yesterday I did a decent amount. Yesterday I went thrifting with my wife. That was a lot of fun. We picked up some food and came back, and then we finished the most recent season of Bridgerton. It was maybe a little anticlimactic, if I had to say. They had a lot of build up, and a lot of the conflict was classic storytelling move of, oh, we're like all of this could have been fixed if you just talked to each other, like just mention stuff. And the solution was obvious right from the beginning of trying to convince the queen that whatever. Anyway, I just felt like it was a little anticlimactic for how much I guess build up they were trying to make from it. Um, but it was still fun, to watch. Let's see. I've started listening to the audiobook Destiny Disrupted. I forget who that's by. One second. Destiny Disrupted. Uh, Tamim Ansari. Um, it's a it's pretty interesting. It's nonfiction, you know. It's just going over, the rise of, uh, like kind of the history of the Middle East, starting from like pre-Muhammad all the way. I'm only on like chapter like 5 or 6 or something, but I assume that it goes up into modern history. But uh, yeah, I don't know. It's been pretty interesting. I'm just trying to round out my knowledge of that era of the world a little bit more. Anyway, so today's video that I'm going to be playing and giving some commentary on is this one by Red Pen. It was posted a year ago. This isn't anything, modern or anything. This is a video. It's entitled "The History and Political Economy of Mao's China." This is really the only thing I'm planning on watching today. So if you're not interested in sort of like historical stuff, this one might not be for you. I'll still try and give interjections and commentary, to give my thoughts on what they're saying. And I'm also going to be in the bottom right down here. I'll be playing some World of Warcraft if you Zoomers can't listen to anything without without some flashy colors and stuff happening in the side of your vision. Then hopefully you'll that'll keep you around so that we can all learn some stuff. But um So anyway, for those super unaware, Mao was kind of like the leader before Xi. I can't remember if there was anyone in between. I'm still kind of learning this too. This is kind of for me as well. But I know that he was kind of the spiritual leader before the Cultural Revolution, and did and I think he inspired a lot of like the revolutionary attitudes during the Cultural Revolution. And I think he's sort of like a complex figure in Chinese history, and that he's both, you know, revered, but also some of the excesses of the Cultural Revolution are looked back at in maybe not the best light all the time from the modern Chinese perspective. But anyway, we'll see what Red Pen has to say about this. This is The History and Political Economy of Mao's China by Red Pen. Let's go.
This video was made possible by the generous support of my patrons. If you would like to join them in helping grow this channel, you can do so at the links in the description
Go
below.
check him out. Patreon Red Pen. I've watched a couple of his other videos. He's pretty good.
On October 7, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace
King.
at Tiananmen Square and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. At the time of this announcement, China had just emerged from a century of humiliation, which
Ugh.
saw continual foreign
Hey,
interference,
we know how that feels. We're just entering it right now, right, Peeps?
widespread opium addiction, the deadliest civil war in human history, and the worst famine ever recorded. Life expectancy stood at 37 years old. The infant
Yikes.
mortality rate was 25%. Transportation, communication, and agricultural systems had been destroyed, and the Communist Party inherited the worst inflation and monetary breakdown in world history. The Communist Party of China embarked on an ambitious project of not only reconstructing an entirely crippled economy and society from scratch, but also promised to do so while building a socialist economy free from exploitation or imperialist interference.
Ooh, the
Lofty
dream.
ideals surrounding the birth of a classless, stateless, moneyless society would always operate in the background of the party's ideology.
Yeah, the end state of communism, I think, is something that we should all get on board with. We're fear-mongered so much against communism, but like, if you just take at face value what is desired by communism, a classless, stateless society, which I do think personally is inevitable at some point in the future, as productivity enters like I don't know. If you want to think about it like Star Trek or whatever, where you can literally you have a replicator that can create anything with like it takes no cost to essentially create whatever you want. Like there would at that point be no need for government and no need for state and no need for borders. So ideally it would just like kind of wither away. But I don't think we're anywhere near that productive capability yet. But the end state I think we should always think of as a positive and look forward to, hopefully one day.
For now, focus was on how to address immediate and concrete problems while reconstructing the economic base of Chinese society. The question of how to build towards socialism would persist as a central ideological struggle between radical and conservative elements within the party.
Still does.
Even with the historical lessons and aid of the Soviet Union, the path towards socialism in China was never entirely clear. The process would be one of major achievements, as well as many setbacks, as the People's Republic set out to achieve what had never before been accomplished.
Still hasn't. Maybe someday. Mao's China, the birth of the People's Republic.
Many Communist Party officials, including Mao, were well adjusted to the rugged conditions and lifestyle of the countryside and were deeply molded by the perspectives, concerns, and interests of the peasantry. Therefore, when the party seized state power and turned its focus to the cities, it confronted social groups that were often skeptical of Communist Party motives. The party often juxtaposed the privileged bourgeois lifestyles and status of urban dwellers against the impoverished realities of the peasantry. Mao warned that urbanization could corrupt the spirit and ideology of the party, and that the rural lifestyle of plain living and hard struggle might give way to the love of pleasure.
So I guess the CCP existed before Mao. This is one thing that I'm wasn't 100% sure on, but okay.
And distaste for continued hard living fostered by city life. Nevertheless, the communists were determined to unite the urban classes, including intellectuals, students, government bureaucrats, and the national bourgeoisie, into the process of revolution. The party discovered a strong connection to urban populations by tapping into the universal hostility that they held towards the Kuomintang. In its dying years, the Kuomintang resorted to terroristic methods, including arbitrary arrests, mass executions, and widespread repression of trade unions to maintain its political control.
Sounds familiar to me.
Many of China's worst social problems continue to persist from the days of Kuomintang rule, such as disease, hunger, prostitution, gambling, but particularly opium addiction. In 1949 Shanghai, nearly 20% of the population of 1.2 million people were addicted to opium,
Oh my
and
gosh.
every morning, specialized street cleaners would gather up the corpses of children and adults who had been murdered during the night or who had died of disease, cold, or starvation. The communists set out to address these immediate concerns through large-scale social crackdowns and criminal penalties for major opium suppliers and dealers, as well as rehabilitation campaigns for addiction. Anti-opium rallies and nationwide education campaigns became widespread, teaching the public about the dangers of opium dependency and stressing the 19th century imperialist origins of the
Ooh,
affliction. Crime
interesting.
and tolerance for criminal
I didn't know
activity
that
declined sharply.
I didn't know that they credited like uh imperialism with the bringing of the opioid like crisis in China, I guess, or opium crisis in China.
And by the end of 1951, opium addiction was no longer a major social problem, and few drug addicts were to be found in China.
Good for
In
you.
many areas, for the first time in over a century, people
we
finally
we need to learn how to do that in America, man. I don't know. It sounded like maybe they were a little bit punitive against the addicts or whatever. I don't really know exactly what all they were doing to them, but at least I guess they got the suppliers a lot and stuff, which I think is a much better way to go about trying to fix problems uh like addiction, especially by the way when those suppliers are health like are like the doctors, like our medical system. um yeah, I think that's a much better way to do it than go after the people who are addicted. Just give the people who are addicted more resources.
once again felt safe to walk the streets of their neighborhood at night without the fear of being robbed. The defeat of opium addiction was not only a progressive social measure, but also another Chinese triumph over imperialism. Opium addiction sparked China's century of humiliation, and shaking off this social ill was symbolic of China's newfound power under its communist government. As a
Yeah,
liberal Chinese
good
intellectual
symbol.
explained, communist anti-foreignism is the result of the humiliation and depression suffered by China for the past century. The communists are out to show their people that they are the masters of their own house, and that no foreigner can lord it here anymore.
Bourgeois. Bourgeois.
In
That's
1949,
such a fun
the
word, by
only
the way,
other
the bourgeois.
communist party to
I guess that probably stemmed from French, if I had to guess.
have secured state power and develop a program directly concerned with socialist development was the Russian Bolshevik Party in 1917. At the time of the revolution, Russia was an underdeveloped, largely agrarian, and semi-feudal economy that had not yet developed the forces of production necessary for a transition towards a fully communist society. The Bolsheviks were therefore forced to figure out a way to guide Russia's history towards socialism without having yet passed through capitalism.
That
In
was, yeah,
1917 Russia, one of the
impossible,
greatest challenges
in my
confronting the
opinion.
Bolsheviks was the question of how the proletarian revolution was
Like in my order of operation of modes of production, it goes, monarchy slash feudalism, capitalism, social democracy, socialism, then finally communism at the very end. I think that their leapfrog attempts, and again, I'm not the most educated. I'm not like a scholar of this stuff, but I'm just kind of giving my input from what I've read and stuff. I think that their attempt to leapfrog straight to like communism may have potentially been like a source of their downfall. And also, obviously, we just did not have the productive capabilities at that point. I don't think we still do necessarily. And I think that it's always going to end up being more of like a progression as opposed to like some like leap into there. But then again, I'm sure they'll piss off a bunch of the ultras who want to, who want to start a communist party today or whatever and seize everything. But whatever. Again, what do I know?
to include the peasantry. The Soviet peasantry generally held no stake or saw little benefit in the revolution, and often held an attitude of indifference towards the new socialist government. It supported the Bolshevik policy of land reform, which was highly compatible with the peasantry's traditional values and lifestyle. But much of the peasantry was highly skeptical or even resistant towards collectivization policies. the Soviet government could not rely on the spontaneous or voluntaristic efforts of the peasantry to help aid in the development of a modern socialist economy, and it therefore often resorted to coercive methods to achieve its policy objectives and mobilize populations in the countryside. In addition to difficulties in the peasantry, the Soviets also attempted to wage an all out class war against the bourgeoisie. The government
Get wrecked,
expropriated the industrial property
bourgeoisie.
of urban bourgeois manufacturers, abolished the stock market, and seized the landed
Based.
property of large landowners in the peasantry, derogatorily labeled as kulaks. These capitalist elements were almost entirely ostracized, and little room was made to accommodate them into the new socialist society. And therefore, hostility towards the socialist government continued to be perpetuated within the Russian bourgeoisie and much of the intelligentsia, resulting in constant efforts to undermine the socialist project. The most significant overarching similarity that Russia held with China was that it too was attempting to build socialism from the wretched base of an underdeveloped, largely agrarian and semi-feudal economy. Like the Russians, Chinese leaders were confronted with the challenges of building a socialist society without having yet passed through the historical stage of capitalism. However, in contrast to the Soviet approach, Mao argued that it was necessary to integrate the peasantry into the process of socialist construction.
Hmm.
Throughout the 1920s,
I'd
30s,
probably
and
agree.
40s, the Communist Party mobilized through the countryside, liberating peasants from landlords and warlords while recruiting new
Ooh,
members into the ranks of the Red
liberate me from landlords, dude. Seriously, like fuck landlords.
Army. Through this process, the peasantry became the mass base of the communist movement, and its interests would need to be accounted for if socialism was going to survive through the agrarian stage of development and revolution in China. In further contrast to the Soviets, the Chinese also opted for a less confrontational approach towards certain elements of the bourgeois class. The underdeveloped state of the Chinese economy necessitated that certain bourgeois elements be allowed to accumulate capital. But in the process of including capital into the revolution, Mao made a firm distinction between the revolution's friends and enemies within the bourgeois class. The national bourgeoisie could be relied on to develop the forces of production and help bring prosperity to China because it held nationalist loyalties that were compatible with party cooperation. However, the reactionary bourgeoisie, or running dogs of imperialism, which included the landlord class, the bureaucratic bourgeoisie, or Guomindang reactionaries, would be repressed and deprived of their democratic rights altogether. Mao
Get
wrote
wrecked.
that democracy is something to be enjoyed by the people, not by reactionaries.
Yeah.
This meant that certain elements of the bourgeois class were recognized as part of the people, who enjoyed freedom of speech, assembly, and association, as well as the right to vote. Throughout the stage of bourgeois democratic revolution, Mao sought to utilize all elements of urban and rural capitalism that were beneficial and not harmful to the economy, to control, not to eliminate capitalism. The commanding heights of the economy, which included monopolies such as energy, transportation, communication, and banking, would remain under the firm control of the state,
Ah,
but
that
would
is so
function
smart.
according to the needs of private
Well, I mean, I
capital.
guess that's the normal. That's
State-owned
what I guess
enterprises.
Marx kind of, I guess, dictated to some extent as well. Of like, you don't have to control every aspect of the capitalist economy to create a more equitable system or like create a transitional socialist state. You just need to control the the big industries or whatever, and that way you can keep you can keep the leash on capital as opposed to the other way around with the capitalists keeping the leash on government. Um, and I don't know. I think that that was probably a good move.
Reduce the cost of raw.
Also, then you don't have to, go straight into like organizing every single aspect of the economy. You only have to organize like it's just less work, I guess. You don't need as much technological advancement and like ability to like control markets and like or you know the classic conundrum of being like in control of everything. You have to kind of predict how much every resource people will need for everything. If you just do it with certain aspects of the economy as opposed to all of it, it's just a much simpler starting point. And I think that's the necessary starting point to getting to a socialist state regardless.
materials such as steel, which benefited the bourgeoisie who relied on these materials in the production process. The private
Yeah.
sector operated through a combination of spontaneous production and tight state controls on wages, prices, trade unions, and worker councils. The national bourgeoisie functioned through a quasi-capitalist basis, selling goods on the market, hiring labor, and seeking a profit. However, the private sector was significantly weakened after many technical experts and specialists had fled the country after the communists had seized power. Mao understood that the skills of these bourgeois elements were urgently necessary to sustain the path of economic recovery, and therefore, concessions and incentives were offered to those who had fled to come back home, fulfill their patriotic duty, integrate into the people's democratic dictatorship, and aid in the process of national rejuvenation. A significant level of cooperation was extended to the national bourgeoisie, but Mao emphasized that the people's democratic dictatorship was to be firmly under the leadership of the working class and Communist Party,
Hell yeah.
maintaining the long march of
Man.
10,000 li towards
It just
socialism.
goes to show how like a strong leader with a vision can really like keep something like this on track and how necessary it is. Like we really need a like strong leader to just advocate for these things in America. And not specifically communism or whatever, but like trade unions and like pro worker policies, and we need that person to be unashamedly like for it at the top of our country, like uh, I don't know, just like disciplining capital at every level. At least for now though, like Trump has gotten away with so much, like in terms of like presidential power, that if we do get like a, FDR type figure or whatever, or like a true socialist revolutionary type person, like they could also just like start, doing whatever they want and ignoring the courts and shit like Trump does. So, like, and then of course all the capitalists will inevitably turn around and be like, "How dare you? You cannot do that," when they're like generally fine with Trump doing it. But I don't know. I hope that one day we get a leader like Mao or someone similar who will, you know, have a vision, stick to it, unashamedly. That'd be it'd be sick.
And ultimately
American Mao.
seeking to transform China into a communist society.
Also, it would just be funny to see like a cornbread, like American football player type come in and be like, "Yes, I will lead the socialist revolution. We will become a transitional socialist state under my watch," or whatever. I don't know. I also think that would be funny too.
The
Put me
rise of
in.
the
Put me
Communist
in,
Party
coach.
marked the end of a protracted civil war and a century of humiliation, and the beginning of order, stability, and efficiency. However, after the Civil War, China was a broken up nation with several territorial divisions and certain areas still beyond the reach of the state, controlled by warlord armies or Kuomintang nationalists. In 1949, the island of Taiwan became one of the most important geopolitical regions in the eyes of the Communist Party. After defeat in the Civil
Wait,
War,
when? Sorry.
in 1949, the island of
1949.
Taiwan became one of the most important geopolitical regions in the eyes of the Communist Party.
Still is.
After defeat in the Civil War, the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan, where it unleashed a brutal repression
The
campaign
true
known as
China.
the White
The
Terror.
true one China. Taiwan, as we all know. The one China. The other China, not real China. Taiwan is the real China. We all agree with this statement.
Killing roughly 40,000 civilians in an overall attempt to pacify the population under the new military dictatorship. From the island, the nationalists actively sought to undermine the communist government, lending support to the influential China lobby in the United States and launching commando attacks on the mainland from Hong Kong
Yeah.
and the Taiwan Strait.
Ugh.
The communists were determined to reunite all Chinese people under the common project of building a modern socialist society.
Look, Taiwan, for I'm sure everyone anyone who probably enjoys my streams will understand that Taiwan is just another proxy in the same way that Ukraine is. Like it is a bulwark against China. We will use and abuse them. We will like destroy their people in order to destabilize China at some point in the future. The only thing that we can hope for is that America will be so decimated and like from their adventurism and all the rest of the world that they will have like no chance against like even by just providing arms to them in the same way that we provide them to Ukraine, that like it will do any dent to like I don't know, in terms of like trying to like destabilize the region, that it won't be too destabilizing, I guess is how I would phrase it. Um, but yeah, like I said, Taiwan's the one true China, real China. Get the fuck out of here. You're not real. You're fake China.
beginning with Taiwan. However, plans to liberate Taiwan from the Kuomintang in the summer of 1950 were thwarted by President Truman's order on June 27th, which sent the United States 7th Fleet to neutralize the Taiwan Strait during the start of the Korean War.
What am I doing here?
In October 1950, China warned the US against crossing the Yalu River, but the US dismissed it as a bluff, believing that the Chinese would not intervene without Soviet air support. But on October 13th, the Chinese decided to intervene without Soviet aid and crossed into North Korea. 200,000 Chinese forces secretly crossed the Yalu River and attacked UN forces near the Sino-Korean border. The first clash between Chinese and US forces occurred on November 1st, with Chinese troops encircling and attacking the US in the Battle of Isan. Mao appointed Zhou Enlai as
Cool
overall
art, dude.
commander.
Communist like era art is like I don't know. It's such an interesting style to me. I really enjoy it.
Isan. Mao appointed Zhou Enlai as overall commander and Peng Dehuai as field commander, who led the People's Volunteer Army to inflict heavy losses on UN forces, prompting them to retreat south of the 38th parallel by mid-December. UN forces evacuated Pyongyang, and President Truman declared a national state of emergency.
Is this the Korea War? I'm not very familiar with the Korean War. Um,
The retreat of US forces sparked celebrations across China. Imperialists had walked all over China for more than a century, and it is likely that the US believed that it could do the same. But after a century of humiliation, imperialist harassment, and military defeat, China finally mustered the strength to defend itself, protect its sovereignty, and deter the strongest military in the world away from its borders. The victory affirmed Mao's declaration from 1949. Our nation will never again be an insulted nation. We have stood up. No imperialist will be allowed to invade our territory again.
oh,
Emboldened by its new victory against the US, the party sought to reunite China by smothering out the remaining Kuomintang influence across the mainland. The Kuomintang
probably a
worked
good call.
alongside warlords to implement brutally repressive systems of labor exploitation, rent, and taxes. Under the warlord system, peasants were quite literally taxed to death, forced to sell everything from their wives and daughters into sex slavery to the shirt on their back before perishing from starvation. Many members of the Communist Party had relatives, sometimes entire families, who were exterminated in mass slaughters wantonly carried out by warlords or the Kuomintang. Therefore, in dealing with the warlords or Kuomintang reactionaries, the Communist Party showed little sympathy and made no excuses for delivering swift and harsh punishments.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of got to. When you got like counter-revolutionaries like that, like there's no other option than dishing out swift and effective punishment, because otherwise you allow space for the counter-revolution to grow. Um, so like I don't know, a lot of people don't really, I feel like, understand how. I'm not gonna say like I don't know if I would say, I'm trying to phrase this well. I guess inevitable. There's an inevitability to like in a revolutionary spirit during a time of revolution that there is swift tamping out of counter-revolutionaries. And it's just like without that happening, I don't think it's possible for the revolution to succeed. So, yeah, there's going to always be some like brutality, but that's just kind of the nature of, the struggle, the revolutionary struggle.
Approximately 800,000 counter-revolutionary trials were held,
Hell
with
yeah.
17% resulting in capital punishment,
Oh,
42% resulting in
17%.
reform.
Hey, 17%. That's not that high for uh, for the counter-revolutionaries. I don't know if I would be that generous if I was to dish out my ideal punishments to counter-revolutionaries. But I think, yeah, okay, maybe I would. I mean, I do think a lot of people can be reformed and re-educated. The surveillance stuff, I don't know about. If you got to surveil them that much, they might need to be, up here. But if they're causing that much trouble, but yeah, I mean, I do think that like when it comes, it's really, I guess, yeah, the worst of the worst counter-revolutionaries who are really fomenting, the end to your revolution, deserve this. And who knows? I say all that, but maybe I'm just being a little hyperbolic in terms of how many I'd throw into this camp. I think I'm just probably in a more frustrated mood with the state of America right now. So,
Through labor, 32% placed under surveillance, and 9% to re-education. In the end, the
hey,
People's
we can only hope that when America is finally has their communist revolution, that we will be so kind, right, to the counter-revolutionaries.
Republic had suppressed the threat of counter-revolution and finally secured the territory of mainland China. But the issue of Taiwan would continue to exist as a point of tension within
Although,
Chinese.
to be fair, I think that America would be even more brutal to their counter-revolutionaries. We're just such a violent people, like with such history of like institutional violence and like so little love for life that I think that Americans, honestly, if they got the revolutionary fervor, like their reign of terror would probably be like, a thousand times what it was in like France or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Society, with US imperialists continuing to support Taiwan independence and using the island as a de facto intelligence outpost within the border of China. Since the early
oh
1920s,
wait, what was that? The Land Reform Campaign, 1950 to 1952.
Since the early 1920s, the communists had been mobilizing among the countryside, liberating peasants from the dictatorial power and control of warlords and the Kuomintang. With state power now secured, and the countryside under the complete sovereignty of the People's Republic, the communists proceeded to launch the Land Reform Campaign of 1950. The Land Reform Campaign sought to abolish the landed gentry class by redistributing land to the peasantry and preparing the ground for the eventual collectivization of
Ooh,
agriculture.
I like those ideas.
During this period, Mao agreed with the party's adherence to the Leninist principle that it was necessary to develop the urban and rural economy in tandem in order to promote the stable development of each. And he was an outspoken critic of the utopian agrarian socialists who wished to implement socialism in the countryside through rapid collectivization. Mao was also critical of the Soviet approach for undertaking collectivization too quickly and for heavily relying on state coercion. In contrast, Mao insisted that collectivization in China must be based on voluntary
Base.
participation and that the process should not be pushed too quickly from above. The
Yeah,
campaign began
you want to
relatively
get buy-in
peacefully in
for sure. I mean, you have to give your vision to the people, right? Like, let's say, like, we get through like this current era of American capitalism, everybody is destitute and hates life and wants something different, and there's a revolutionary fervor. You just need to explain to people why this future that you're building would be better than what they currently have. And if things are bad enough, even brain broken hogs in America will be like, okay, you know what, let's give it a shot. Like, yeah, if you're going to take away the giant mega farms owned by these corporations and distribute them to like me and my buddies to then have some jobs as farmers or whatever, like yeah, that sounds good to me. Like I think that yeah, you need both the carrot and the stick, but ideally you want as much of the carrot as possible to get people on board with your revolution. And people aren't as like I don't know. People can I think learn to understand the goals and ideals of communism even after being as brain broken as they have been in America, or at least I hope they can.
In the summer of 1950, local cadres were trained, land was surveyed, pilot projects were introduced, and local militias were established. Large land holdings were abolished, broken up into small plots, and redistributed to every individual peasant family. It is difficult to overestimate the degree to which the peasantry began to see itself no longer as a passive victim of external circumstance, but as an active agent in creating its own destiny.
Hell yeah.
Hundreds of millions of people who were formerly enslaved, humiliated, and exploited in the worst imaginable ways had acquired their own land and become the master of their own house.
Cool photos.
The land reform campaign was a great success. However, differences in soil fertility, labor power, and work ethic led to class distinctions and the re-emergence of usury, with wealthier peasants lending credit to poorer ones. This type of economic individualism was often encouraged by party cadres who misunderstood the land reform policy and purpose, mistakenly believing that it was their duty to help individual peasants achieve wealth in the new era of stability. But the party repeatedly emphasized that this was not the case, and that the land reform campaign was only a first step in a long march in developing the rural and urban economy and building towards socialism. The land reform campaign was inherently opposed to the class interests of the rural landlords, but landlords as individuals were not entirely excluded from the process of building revolution, as long as they surrendered their property and class status. Some landlords violently resisted the expropriation of their land.
Some. In America, it would be all landlords. All landlords would rise up in arms if the government tried to take their shit.
But in general, they did not pose the same counter-revolutionary threat as the Guomindang or warlords. However, during the process of land redistribution, an open class struggle emerged throughout the countryside. The spontaneous and violent hostilities of the peasantry towards their former exploiters was mostly quelled by the party, who focused on carrying out the land reform campaign with minimal instances of violence. To do this, the party introduced struggle sessions, which allowed the peasantry to publicly shame their former landlords, expose their crimes to the community, and express their pent-up anger and frustration. The point of the
Struggle sessions. That's so like so funny to me as an idea. I mean, it's not that much different, I guess, than like I said before, like the stocks or whatever. Like bringing, and I did say in one of my recent videos that I would be in favor of taking all of our billionaires and throwing them in the stocks so everybody can go yell at them. So I guess maybe I'm not that opposed to struggle sessions after all, but it is kind of funny thinking about taking like a chud-brained American landlord and like having a bunch of like like poor people just come up and like just yell at them. Like what would they? I don't know. I'm curious what they'd be thinking. It's just such a funny concept to imagine this in America.
sessions was to provide the peasantry with an organized outlet to denounce their former landlords without hostilities emerging into fatalities and open violence. But even with these measures in place, many of the peasants took full advantage of their new freedom and took no qualm in
Hey, that's how you get them to reform, though. Like I think wasn't didn't was it G or maybe G's Top G's father, I think had to go through this process of like wearing like a dunce hat or something, if I remember correctly, and going through the town square getting made fun of. And look at how he turned out. He's turning China into a uh, state capital utopia with public transit. Like, I don't know. Maybe it works. Maybe this is what we need.
in murdering their former landlord in retribution for their crimes. For many of these former tenant farmers, the only reason they had not delivered retribution sooner was because of their economic dependency on their exploiters. But under the new land reform campaign, former landlords and former tenants were made equals, and the landlords were no longer safe from the revangism of the peasantry without their class privilege. Now that the gentry class had been abolished, and the peasantry had become aware of its revolutionary agency, the conditions were now ripe to proceed towards small-scale co-ops and eventually the creation of large-scale communes.
Co-ops. Hey, if this operation that I'm running here ever gets more than just me, it will be a co-op. So don't you worry. Don't you worry, people. I will not betray. I will not
The
be a
land reform
counter-revolutionary.
campaign was widely supported by the peasantry and was implemented with great success. However, the establishment of small-scale independent production inhibited the introduction of large-scale agricultural techniques and implements such as tractors. Therefore, the party developed a countrywide plan for large-scale consolidation of these small plots, with the overall goal of agricultural collectivization, introducing modernized production and increasing agricultural output. The first step was to organize mutual aid teams where households would assist each other to forge patterns of cooperative work.
Hey, great idea.
The second stage would combine mutual aid teams into semi-socialist agricultural producer cooperatives, where families pooled their resources and farmed cooperatively. Finally, these lower stage cooperatives would be amalgamated into higher or advanced cooperative farms, which would abolish private land ownership and employ large-scale technologies such as tractors and fertilizers. When agricultural collectivization was initially implemented, the party consensus was based on proceeding with caution. The Soviet experience taught the Chinese that delaying rural collectivization would lead to class polarization and the re-emergence of capitalism. But if undertaken too rapidly, collectivization could have destabilizing and catastrophic results. To mitigate against this risk, Mao urged the party to implement a program of agricultural collectivization based on voluntary participation by the peasantry. However, mass enthusiasm led to a rapid and widespread embrace of the campaign throughout the countryside. The party initially anticipated that the first stage of land reform, consisting of breaking up and redistributing small plots, would be completed by 1952. But by this point, nearly 40% of the peasantry had
Wow.
already gone on to forming mutual aid teams.
Speedsters.
Towards the start of 1955, nearly 60% of the peasantry had formed mutual aid teams and had moved on to forming cooperatives.
I think that mutual aid is like everyone's first introduction into collectivism, and I think they are very important. And I think that if you want your community, like it's just you want your community to be better, so you go out and offer some form of aid to them. And then, if you want to preach the gospel of communism, you can, but you don't have to, obviously. But like, yeah, you go out and help your fellow neighbor, help your, and then they get maybe they start to feel a little bit more sense of community, and then everybody, um, you know, then you start to feel more involved in the process and everything. And I think then you start to understand why we want to be a collective people and not a whole bunch of siloed off individuals or whatever, what we can accomplish if we work together. I think that's a great entry point for a lot of people.
The party initially aimed for the creation of 100,000 cooperatives to be established by mid-1955.
Man, can you
But
imagine?
the peasantry
Can
dramatically
you imagine if America was like, we need 100,000 co-ops? It would never happen. Like, they're like, we need zero co-ops. There can be nobody. Everything must be owned by a capital owner.
exceeded even the most optimistic expectations by forming roughly 650,000 cooperatives by this time. By 1956, 1.9 million lower stage cooperatives had been established,
Man, they're
and
crushing
fueled
it.
by optimism, the party raised targets once more, anticipating the full completion of collectivized agriculture by 1958.
Full commune.
Mao described the movement as a raging tidal wave that had swept away all the old demons and ghosts, attributing its success to the fact that the people were
Ghost
filled
spooky.
with an immense enthusiasm for socialism.
Hey, I'm right there
For
with you,
Mao,
buddy.
the enthusiasm of the peasantry and the rapid mobilizations demonstrated from below were evidence that the party's policies were too conservative, while the movement of the masses was in advance of the leadership. He became critical of party members who were tottering along like women with bound feet and cover up their
You don't
dilatoriness
need to be
by
sexist
quoting the
about
experience of the
it.
Soviet Union. With the tremendous success of land reform and agricultural collectivization, Mao no longer appeared to believe that it was necessary to maintain a long march of 10,000 li towards the realization of socialism in 100 years. At the Eighth Party Congress in
A
1956,
100-year
he
plan,
declared that
dude.
China
100 years. He planned out the goals of the country for 100 years. Can you imagine America ever doing something like that? No, we don't. What's a year, right? We don't need years. What we got something better than years, everybody. We got quarters. We got quarterly earning reports that what how could planning for a year be any better than only planning one quarter at a time? Come on, people.
would catch up with and surpass the most powerful capitalist countries in several dozen years, and finish building a socialist state in 15 years.
Okay, well, they were a little off on that. That's
Karl
a
Marx
wrong
wrote
thought.
that men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under
Yeah.
circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. Throughout history, communist parties have always debated the extent to which men make their own history against the influence of circumstances transmitted from the past.
There's some great mustaches, dude. Communists, I don't know what is in their blood, but they got the best facial hair. Like they have more hair follicles per square inch than an average person. Has anyone ever looked into this? Has anybody like done a study on like communists versus capitalists like hair follicle density? Somebody needs to get on this. Someone needs to figure this out. Like there's something going on here.
The debate essentially reduces down to two sides. On the one hand, there are leftist tendencies that seek to be
Trots.
just ahead of the masses, hold idealistic views, push for radical social change, and always view the current moment as the necessary moment for political action. On the other hand, there are conservative tendencies that tend to follow the masses, focus on material and economic conditions, caution against dramatic social transformation, and promote gradual social change through incremental reforms.
Mm.
When it came to the question of social change, Marx and Lenin both recognized that there were two basic and fundamental principles that needed to be acknowledged. The first principle was that transforming social relations was strictly regulated by the degree of technological development and material abundance in society.
Sorry, my cat was annoying me. They almost knocked some stuff off. I gotta go back.
The first principle was that
Maybe get down.
transforming social relations was
Get down.
strictly regulated by the degree of technological development and material abundance in society. Quantitative improvements in the forces of production give rise to qualitative transformations in the relations of production. Second, Marx and Lenin maintained that the relations and forces of production, constituting the economic base of society, gave rise to the ideological superstructure and shaped all other social institutions. In 1949, Mao initially agreed with these theoretical premises, believing that China would need to make use of capitalist elements on the long march of 10,000 li towards socialism. However, after witnessing how quickly and enthusiastically the peasantry was carrying out the directives of the party, Mao drifted away from these premises and began to theoretically deviate from Marx and Lenin.
Theoretically.
The peasantry had wildly exceeded all of the party's targets.
Yeah, they all got that strong jaw, dude.
targets for collectivization, and it began to appear that the revolutionary agency of the peasantry was sweeping away all the external barriers to achieving socialism. Mao was now convinced more than ever in the capabilities of the peasantry and the principle of the mass line.
Believe in the
He was
peasants.
also increasingly convinced in the power of voluntarism, human will, and the consciousness of the masses in making and shaping their own history. Even though the countryside was the least developed segment of the Chinese economy, he believed that it would be the first to socialize production and lay the technical foundation for a socialist economy. Mao sought to achieve this by relying on the technical expertise of the people rather than the technical expertise of urban intellectuals or the bourgeoisie. He therefore increasingly came to emphasize the importance of scientific education, particularly aimed towards peasants and youth. Peasants were poor and uncorrupted by bourgeois ideology, while the youth were like blank slates that had not yet been filled with traditional ideas
The
and
youth.
values. Mao described peasants and youth as poor and blank, and therefore ideal revolutionary agents, often the most willing to carry out revolutionary tasks. As a result, Mao Zedong thought emerged as a unique branch
Yeah.
of philosophy that was rooted in, but also revised the theories of Marx and Lenin. He agreed with
Maybe
fundamental
that's why we like propagandize our youth and our poor so much. Like maybe that's why it stops them from like truly living out their revolutionary potential.
theoretical principles, but introduced major revisions through the idea that revolutionizing education and productive relations would in turn develop the productive forces. This theoretical departure signaled that China was now clearly on its own developmental path and was no longer relying on lessons drawn from the Soviet model. It was taking a deep plunge into the unknown and no longer had the aid of historical experience to guide party decisions along the way.
100 Flowers Campaign, 1956-1957.
In February 1956, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev delivered his secret speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The speech presented a sweeping denunciation of the crimes and mistakes made during the Stalin era, including the execution of innocent communists, weakening the Red Army by purging its leaders, mismanaging the Nazi invasion, deporting entire ethnic groups during the war, and forming a cult of personality around Stalin. Although Khrushchev's speech was made at a closed congressional session, it caused widespread shock, with its effects carrying reverberations into every aspect of Soviet society. After the Soviet triumph in World War II, Stalin was upheld as a national hero who not only saved the Soviet Union from a Nazi takeover, but
I mean,
did
he
so
did.
while bringing it from the plow to the atom bomb. All of this was erased as a
It's solid.
de-Stalinization
Yeah,
campaign
I mean, he did crush the Nazis. Like, yeah, good for him.
commenced, seeking to revive the historical image of Stalin as a tyrant and his followers as criminal accomplices. The speech crippled national morale and provided an opening for counter-revolutionary tendencies to undermine the Soviet project altogether, which they eventually did in 1991. The whole ordeal was also somewhat embarrassing for Chinese officials, who had been praising Stalin for decades and referring to the Soviet model as an example of success. Now, they were being forced to reluctantly account for the crises and failures under Stalin as well. Mao's response to Khrushchev's speech eventually came in April, acknowledging Stalin's mistakes but praising his contributions to socialism. Mao was critical of Khrushchev's approach of blaming all the Soviet Union's failures on one man and stressed the need for a balanced historical analysis of Stalin's actions and policies.
Hey, that's what I say too. I'm no like Stalin fan or anything. I'm not really a fan of any. Well, maybe that's not true. I don't really consider myself necessarily like a fan of like historical actors. I just think that we need to objectively acknowledge what they contributed, both in the positive and the negative. And you can always tell you're propagandized if you're not able to say like one good thing about like, you know, uh, about someone like Stalin or whatever. Like he crushed the Nazis. Everyone can acknowledge that. And there were some aspects I think that were good, but there were some that were bad.
Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin also came at a time when similar criticisms were being made towards Mao by Chinese intellectuals. The intelligentsia generally criticized the overbearing party control over intellectual productivity. Many of them complained that the party's
Is
ideology was
is
too
what I'm doing,
restrictive or
intellectually
too
productive
lax.
people.
Others criticized the party's appointment of administrators and specialists to posts that they were unqualified to fulfill. But almost all of them expressed a reluctance to speak freely in the face of the party bureaucracy.
Never go against the bureaucrats.
Intellectuals also sought clarity on the nature of their social status, where they fit in relation to the people's democratic dictatorship, and their role within the new socialist system. Intellectuals were not exactly bourgeois, but they were generally privileged urban dwellers who held varied support for the revolution. Zhou Enlai attempted to clarify the nature of this ambiguous relationship by announcing that the overwhelming majority of intellectuals have become government workers in the cause of socialism and are already part of the working class. The party sought to bring the intelligentsia onto the side.
Yeah, intellectualism or like intellectuals are an odd group, right? Because they're not like they contribute labor in a sense that they are like I'm assuming a lot of them are like PhD professors or studying for like, creating new technologies or whatever, right? Like you're studying stuff and accomplishing things and it's usually funded through the government, right? And so I guess I would probably not put them in the bourgeois class if I had to, even if they have the aesthetics of it a lot of the time, of like old money, that sort of stuff. I don't really think that most intellectuals or just like scientists or like, uh, people who commit their life to studying a subject or whatever, I wouldn't necessarily put them in the bourgeois. I would probably classify them as the proletariat personally.
Of the revolution by encouraging it to speak freely and criticize the party bureaucracy.
They
Mao
would definitely 100% be if they were, or would be like workers or whatever if they were contributing later labor at the forces of capital, I guess. And so in that regard, because they're contributing labor not necessarily for the forces of capital all the time, but also for the forces of um, like the government or the social programs, like that sort of stuff, then in that regard, yeah, they're definitely like workers slash proletariat.
agreed with the intelligentsia
Was
that
the
not only
aesthetic
had
of some
academic
bourgeois
criticism been
stuff.
stifled by the party bureaucracy, but that this obstacle presented a major hindrance to the development of potentially useful ideas. He understood that a modern socialist society could only be established through the intellectual freedom to explore and debate new ideas and areas of inquiry. Therefore, in response to
Where
growing
my debate
criticism,
lords at?
the Communist Party of China introduced a new campaign to mend the growing rift between the party and the intelligentsia. The Hundred Flowers campaign was introduced in the spring of 1956 to rectify intellectual freedom and promote the exchange of ideas. Mao suggested that the party should be open to criticism to avoid falling into error. He claimed that, for a party as much as for an individual, there is a great need to hear opinions different from its own. Mao declared that artists should let 100 flowers bloom, and that scientists should let 100 thoughts contend. The distinction was important because, unlike artists, scientists were seen as apolitical and uncorrupted by ideological debate.
So apolitical. Scientists, the most apolitical. It all depends what their science is being used for, right? Like scientists are very often tools of capital, like they're used by capitalists in order to, you know, promote the concept and like the concepts that are beneficial to capitalists, or like, uh, I don't know. I think that yeah, they like scientists are not inherently apolitical. It all just depends on what they're using, I guess, who they're being used by. Like, if they're being used by the government to, actually, I guess they're never apolitical really, because either way they're going to be, their work will be used by the government or the capitalists to enact the change that they want. So yeah, in that regard, I guess they're not apolitical at all.
Scientists were therefore free to exchange in a wide range of discussions, and the campaign even helped usher in novel research in the field of genetics. Artists, on the other hand, were slightly more weary of potential repercussions, but nevertheless began to speak out freely, protesting the government's interference in academic life and criticizing the rigidity of party ideological orthodoxy. Students at Peking University created a democratic wall in which they posted criticisms of the party with posters and letters. While most criticisms were made on the tacit assumption of Communist Party power and expressed everyday grievances for the party to address, there was also a stream of counter-revolutionary criticism expressed through wholesale indictments of the socio-political order. It quickly became clear that there was still a strong sentiment which sought to oust the communists, transfer power to the hands of the Kuomintang, or see various provinces of China break away into independent states. In June
Uh,
1957, Mao declared that some bad capitalists, bad intellectuals, and reactionary elements in society are mounting wild attacks against the working class and the Communist Party in an attempt to overthrow the state power led by the working class. He attempted to revive the campaign by clarifying the distinction between the poisonous weeds and the beautiful flowers in
okay.
his work, The Correct Handling of Contradictions Among the People. But it was too late. Once again, the intolerable specter of counter-revolution had reared its head. The party was ultimately compelled to call an end to the campaign and
You know what? Maybe 100 flowers was like a little bit too much. Maybe they should have stuck with like 50 flowers or something instead of 100 flowers. 100 flowers, that's too many flowers. There's like some of these flowers are a little counter-revolutionary. I think we might have to, stamp them out a little bit.
commenced a general crackdown on the tendencies that sought to overthrow the government and overturn the revolution. Deng Xiaoping played a leading role in the anti-rightist campaign of removing the poisonous weeds from among the beautiful flowers.
Purge them.
However, he took to the task with great
Oh, that was
overzealous.
something I did this morning too. I weeded some of my they're growing in my rock, like we got some rocks around our where we have our grill and stuff. So I weeded that out this morning too. So I
While
was, hey, I was doing my part out there. All you revolutionaries who say I'm not doing my part to stoke the fuel of revolution. I was out there taking those weeds out, those counter-revolutionary weeds that were trying to destroy my patio. I took them out, okay?
rounding up over 500,000 individuals for political persecution. Mao was often reluctant to give direct instructions to party cadres, but even he criticized Deng's heavy-handed approach, writing to him that, "If we kill too many, we will forfeit public sympathy and a shortage of labor power will arise." Deng later admitted that mistakes were made in the crackdown, and noted that many of those who were arrested were later rehabilitated. The anti-rightist
It's
crackdown
ominous music.
revealed Mao's false assumptions heading into the Hundred Flowers campaign. He believed that free intellectual debate and discussion would generate and give rise to correct ideas, but in reality, it gave rise to factionalism, conflict,
Yeah.
and dissent.
It's a
However, the
balancing act. It's
campaigns
a
were not
balancing act.
entirely irredeemable. Intellectual freedom flourished for a period and generally continued on in the natural sciences.
You
The
need to allow some dissent, right? Obviously. Like, you can't have a society that does not allow some dissent. However, you also can't allow the counter-revolutionaries to build power because otherwise it will, you know, kill the momentum that you're trying to build towards a socialist, a socialist state. So, sorry. So like you need to find that balance of allowing people to have the freedom to dissent and to discuss openly what they think the best things are, but also not letting people abuse that system to then take try to stoke counter-revolutionary fervor that will lead to worse outcomes for the working class. Like it's all just a balancing game, and it depends entirely on the context that you're living in. Um, you know, Like, I think it would look a lot different in America than it did in China, if we ever, someday get there. But
The wave of criticism towards the party allowed it to gain a more intimate grasp of urban grievances. It exposed rightist tendencies and allowed the party to respond to the
rightist.
scattered and scant ideological elements that continue to resist.
I'm so sorry. I gotta laugh at this. This is yeah, I don't know. This lady who's just having the time of her life riding this tractor on like the waves of the ocean or something. Like this is a pretty funny photo. This seems like something that AI would create a little bit.
Resist the road to socialism. But perhaps most importantly, the Hundred Flowers campaign laid much of the political and ideological groundwork for the launch of the Great Leap Forward.
Great leap. Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1961.
While pockets of revolutionary fervor continued to flourish in the cities, especially among students and youth, Mao's general focus
The
remained on the
Ute.
peasantry. The great success of the peasantry in not only meeting but exceeding quotas and deadlines for agricultural
they all just got they all got Chad face, dude. Like that I just uh, the art from this time period is just so fascinating to me.
collectivization
And they always like portray everybody as like these like tall like they all kind of look like cornbread like white dudes with like but like who work out a lot who but they're just Asian. I don't know. It's kind of funny.
led Mao to believe that the peasantry was in advance of the party bureaucracy, and that many officials were dragging behind the masses like women with bound feet. Mao believed that it was necessary for the party to catch up to the masses and announced the introduction of the Great Leap Forward in January 1958. The Great Leap Forward campaign was introduced to not only modernize the technological capacities of the Chinese economy, but to do so by revolutionizing the totality of social relations altogether. The campaign began with a radical decentralization of political authority in the countryside, offering greater autonomy and decision-making power over to lower-level cadres to aid the peasantry in carrying out community-based economic planning according to local
That's a cool
conditions.
picture.
The campaign also introduced new social services to the countryside. Many peasants who had never before seen a doctor were offered basic services at newly established local clinics. And likewise, many peasants who had never seen a piece of literature were educated in simplified Chinese, which became standardized under the Communist Party for the sole purpose of spreading literacy among the peasantry. Education campaigns were initiated alongside economic reforms that encouraged the masses to become masters of modern science in the process of carrying out their everyday work. The party sought to democratize access to scientific and political literature and enable the peasantry to apply technical ideas
It's like, what the fuck is this? What am I looking at?
to technical problems faced at the local level.
He just looks very
This
fascinated.
approach encouraged the peasantry to merge theory with practice, learn through trial and error, and integrate skills acquisition with practical experience. The goal was to allow ordinary workers to become not only politically conscious, but scientifically minded in various fields, thereby pursuing a path towards industrialization that not only abolished the division between mental and manual labor, but also abolished the division of labor between town and country. A major
Good
principle
goal.
guiding industrial development was achieving technological independence from both the urban intelligentsia as well as the Soviet Union. Mao argued that industrialization of the rural economy was a process that confronted challenges that the Soviet Union and the urban intelligentsia were ill-equipped to solve, as neither of these groups had experience with the unique condition of the peasantry. As scientists and technical experts in the Soviet Union and urban intelligentsia worked towards making breakthroughs at the pinnacle of knowledge in their field, what the peasantry needed was basic resources and training. Therefore, the economic strategy of the Great Leap Forward focused on the development of small-scale industries across the countryside, seeking to maximize value output through the utilization of human labor power rather than the development of large-scale machines and infrastructure. Mao argued that in order to mobilize the peasantry to undertake such a feat, it was necessary to incentivize production by slowly lifting the peasantry out of poverty. He
Hey,
insisted that
good idea.
collectivization of agriculture would need to benefit the peasantry and not simply serve the ends of achieving urban industrialization.
Good. Hey, great
One of
ideas,
the
man.
most publicized of these small scale industrial projects was the Backyard Furnaces campaign, aimed at
If you
transforming
want to keep
China
the
into a
revolution going, you got to keep the peasantry or the lower end of the working class happy. So the great ideas.
global steel producer. Throughout the campaign, millions of small blast furnaces were swiftly constructed across the countryside, which melted raw iron, scrap metal, farming implements, and even household utensils. Despite the intoxicating enthusiasm seen throughout the countryside, the overall results of the Backyard Furnace campaign proved disastrous.
uh,
The steel produced was of poor quality, and the program wasted tremendous raw materials and enormous quantities of labor power, setting China's economic development back several years. With so much of the labor force in the countryside being diverted to small-scale industrial projects, agricultural productivity also declined significantly. New cultivation methods yielded questionable results, labor shortages led to crops rotting in storage, and pests continued to undermine yields. In response to the agrarian crisis, the Great Leap Forward launched the Four Pests campaign, which encouraged the peasantry to exterminate as many mosquitoes, flies, sparrows, and rats as possible.
wow. I gotta look at that one again.
As many mosquitoes, flies,
Wow.
sparrows, and
That must have been a big ass fly and a big ass mosquito.
which encouraged the peasantry to
Jesus.
exterminate as many
Look at
mosquitoes,
that. They got a knife going through it. That thing's huge.
flies, sparrows, and rats as possible. The campaign was
That fly
driven by
was as
the
big
idea
as a
that
sparrow.
man must conquer nature and ended in the estimated destruction of 1.5 billion rats, 1 billion sparrows,
Got him.
220 million pounds of flies, and over 24 million pounds of mosquitoes.
Should have all just gotten cats, dude. Cats, that's what they're there for. All those rats and sparrows, they'd be gone like that.
The Four Pests campaign
The cats I've always said are they're a part of the revolutionary force. They're not counter-revolutionary. See that cat on my screen right now? Oh, wait. Right there. Do you see that? Do you hear that? That's the most revolutionary cat you've ever seen.
was a great success in meeting the goals it set out to
Ready to
achieve,
lead some struggle
but such
sessions.
colossal impact on
Right,
particular
Evie?
species of animals and insects had a
Yeah.
major effect on the ecological balance of the countryside. The presence of locusts, of which rats and sparrows were natural predators, rapidly spread and devastated crop yields,
Uh-oh.
greatly contributing to the famine of 1958 to 1961.
Man,
The
there's
legacy of the Great
always
Leap Forward
consequences.
has always
There's always consequences with trying to manipulate nature, Sometimes they're unforeseen and not good. So,
been deeply scarred by the tragic humanitarian crisis it ushered in. The estimated number of deaths it caused vary according to the different methodologies as well as political perspectives of those making the assessment. In a declassified
according to capitalists, communism killed like what, 100 billion people or something. Like what? They always attribute every death under every circumstance to be like the direct cause of communism. It's so funny.
report, Mao admits in a discussion with Field Marshal Montgomery that the campaign caused 5 million
They were like, that person got like gored to death by a boar. Clearly the fault of communism.
natural deaths. Deng Xiaoping, in his condemnation of the Great Leap policies, claimed that 16.5 million people had died of famine. Western scholars claim that the number is closer to 30 million, while anti-communist writers have inflated the figure to 40 million, 45 million, 55 million, or even higher.
Yeah, the more anti-communist you are, the bigger the number goes up.
The actual number of people who perished in the famine is often exaggerated for political reasons.
Of
But what
course.
remains certain is that China's population was growing annually by about 2%, or roughly 15 million people in 1958. This figure dropped to 1.3% in 1959, 0.3% in 1960,
So they just stopped
and
growing.
0.17%
I'm sure
in
people died,
1961.
but
Crude estimates are based on the assumption that if historic population growth trends had continued, an additional 30 million people would have still been alive by the year 1962.
Uh, yeah, that's not a way to do it though. Like, that's not how deaths work. That is a lack of births. Lack of births is not deaths unless you're one of the most ravenous anti-abortion freaks out there.
However, scholars continue to debate the effects of various social factors which may have directly or indirectly impacted the overall population growth during this period. The party eventually learned about the rise of famine in the countryside through peasant soldiers in the People's Liberation Army, who had received letters from their families reporting on the conditions of the peasantry. Many of these soldiers informed their superiors on what
Yeah,
they were
yeah.
being told, which eventually made its way to the higher ranks before the Great Leap Forward was brought to an abrupt halt in 1961.
Ow, Evie. The Lucian Conference, 1959. Evie, you gotta chill.
Throughout
Okay,
all of
I'll hold you
China,
for a second.
Mao became the single most important symbol of
Okay,
revolutionary
Evie, you can't
excellence.
do that.
His name was sacred. His photo was in every home. His quotes were widely memorized, repeated, and publicized. He personally held extraordinary influence over the members of the Communist Party as well as the people of China, and was seen almost as a type of genius, intellectually standing above all others, militarily, philosophically, and politically. However, by 1959, some leading party officials were beginning to express doubts towards Mao's leadership and the direction
Uh-oh.
he was taking the party. In the summer that year, a meeting of top party officials gathered at the Lushan Conference to review the progress of the Great Leap Forward. Before the conference began, Defense Minister Peng Dehuai circulated a letter containing a damning attack on Mao and his rural policies. Peng argued that the Great Leap was ushering in winds of exaggeration, an epidemic of bragging, and warned that petty bourgeois fanaticism was undermining official reports and statistics. As defense minister, Peng's perspective on the Great Leap Forward was largely influenced by concerns surrounding national security. Throughout the Communist Party's history, many of the military battles it had emerged victorious from were largely thanks to the aid and support provided by the Soviet Union. Peng disagreed with the Great Leap policies for not only seeking technological independence from the Soviets, but also for redirecting large-scale industrial capital towards small and medium-scale industries. For Peng, not only did the Great Leap Forward policies further alienate China's closest ally, but further strain the military's modernization efforts. After presenting Peng's letter at the Lushan Conference, a discussion emerged which quickly escalated into Peng hurling personal attacks against Mao.
Uh-oh.
The party addressed
Don't do
Peng's
that.
concerns, but ultimately arrived at a consensus in favor of Mao and the Great Leap policies.
Yeah.
Peng was dismissed from his post and condemned to
Yeah.
public humiliation.
You gotta watch your tongue, dude. If you're, he is like the leader of the revolution. Like you can't just I mean, I don't know. This was if you come for the king, you best not miss, right?
humiliation, closing the first major internal party crisis since the founding of the People's Republic. At the end of the Lushan Conference, Mao still held an unflinching commitment to achieving communization through the Great Leap policies. He defended their necessity and, along with Lin Biao, pushed for continuing the campaign despite the current difficulties. He declared that if the Great Leap and the communes were allowed to perish, he would go to the countryside to lead the peasants to overthrow the government.
Wow, badass.
However, by the start of 1960,
Good
Mao
threat.
was finally compelled to recognize the catastrophe wrought by the Great Leap and came to reluctantly accept the inevitability of dismantling the campaign. To further add to the crisis, Peng's concerns regarding Soviet alienation were validated the following year in the midst of the worst of the famine. In the summer of 1960, Nikita Khrushchev recalled 1,400 Soviet scientists and technicians working in 250 Chinese enterprises across the country. The Soviets withdrew support in the face of Mao's adventurism, likely viewing the expertise of specialists and technicians as redundant in the face of the Great Leap policies. Mao charged the Soviets with sabotaging China's efforts and condemned Khrushchev's treachery as a major contributing factor to the overall crisis.
I don't know anything about this stuff, by the way. The interactions between China and the Soviet Union back then. So this is interesting stuff for me.
The perceived betrayal of the Soviet Union in China's most dire moment of need delivered a sharp blow to the socialist solidarity between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic. Tensions culminated with the Sino-Soviet split in 1961, with Mao declaring that the USSR was a social imperialist rival, posing a
Yeah.
danger to China as threatening as the one posed by US imperialism.
The conservative reaction, 1960 to 1962.
When the Bolsheviks confronted widespread famine in the aftermath of the Russian Civil War, Lenin introduced the new economic policy to revive and stabilize the economy. The new economic policy temporarily reintroduced market mechanisms, private property, and wage labor as a strategic retreat or pause on socialist construction in order to promote stability, order, and efficiency in the face of disorder and humanitarian crises. The new economic policy was embraced by some and hated by others, but ultimately the policy was successful in stabilizing prices and grain production, providing fresh ground for a renewed advance toward socialism. China's version of the new economic policy began in 1960 to 1961 as a series of emergency measures to combat food shortages and famine. Market reforms, formulated by Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, were generally popular and restored many of the economic institutions previously dismantled during the Great Leap. The state swiftly centralized control over distribution, while production was revived by introducing new administrative bodies and party cadres to rural areas and villages. Urban support programs were introduced, tools and aid for the countryside were supplied, restabilization efforts were made in the agrarian economy, urban production was rationalized, inefficient enterprises were closed, rural migration was encouraged to ease urban strains, and higher wage rates and bonuses were offered in key sectors. By late 1961, urban and rural conditions stabilized, production rebounded, and after 3 years of decline, population growth was back to pre-1959 levels.
Hey, they fixed
However,
it at
with the
least.
shift towards a market system, material incentives and private plots
Yeah.
also led to growing
Okay,
inequalities.
so they're kind of, it sounds like they're kind of shifting from maybe their purist ideals of a, you know, socialist revolution, like to bring about socialism through like collectivizing the peasantry, slowly building up to full communes. It sounds like they're kind of retreating from that into the sort of state capitalism that we know China as today, where they allow capitalism to flourish to some extent, but they always have complete and total control over, what the capitalists are allowed to do, what industries are allowed to, flourish or not, in order to align with the nation state's interest, which um, so I don't know. I'm sure that the purest of pure revolutionaries wouldn't be happy with that, uh, but I still think that it's probably the necessary. I don't know. It's probably a necessary transition to get to actual socialism. Um, so I don't
And
know.
corruption
It
among
seems to be working for them, I guess, at least is what I would say now. They're crushing it in terms of their uh, productive capabilities and ability to build and shit. I accidentally pressed a button. I got thrown way back here. I hope this is about where I was.
After presenting Peng's letter at the Lushan conference, a discussion emerged which quickly escalated into Peng hurling personal attacks against the
We're
Union in
past that.
China's most dire moment of need, delivered a sharp blow to the socialist solidarity between the Soviet Union and privileged industrial workers began to re-emerge.
Oh, this is
To
about where we
close,
were. Sorry, I had to
rural
find it.
migration was encouraged to ease urban strains, and higher wage rates and bonuses were offered in key sectors. By late 1961, urban and rural conditions stabilized, production rebounded, and after 3 years of decline, population growth was back to
We're
pre-1959
back, baby.
levels. However, with the shift towards a market system, material incentives and private plots also led to growing inequalities and corruption among rural cadres, and a new class of wealthy peasants and privileged industrial workers began to re-emerge. By 1962, Serious divisions within the party's top leadership became clear between those who continued to endorse the Great Leap policies and those who opposed them. On the one hand, Mao and Lin Biao defended the policies and the necessity of continuing the construction of people's communes. But on the other hand, Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi were more critical, promoting economic reforms that were far more conservative.
Who's gonna win?
In 1962, the party convened the 7,000 Cadres Conference to discuss the failed policies of the Great Leap Forward. The purpose of the conference was to identify and correct the major underlying problems which had contributed to the creation of the crisis. During the conference, Liu Shaoqi, the second president of China and vice chairman of the Communist Party, delivered a speech that attributed 30% of the famine to natural disasters and 70% to man-made mistakes. The first major contributing factor was in regard to the
Capitalists love hearing that. They love hearing, "Oh, it was your fault, Mao."
overwhelming sense of optimism that drove up grain quotas. Every level of Chinese society, from the lower level peasants to the higher party officials, were swept away in a wave of optimism fueled by previous success in agricultural collectivization. This optimism carried through in raising quotas and speeding forward with the Great Leap. The second major contributing factor was in regard to the ubiquitous practice of false reporting from the lowest to highest levels. Peasants, local cadres, regional and provincial committees would compete among each other for the greatest grain yields and forge inflated figures on their reports in an attempt to earn party favor. By the time these reports had made their way to the leadership level, these grossly overinflated figures led party officials to believe that grain yields were much higher than they actually were. But the state
Yeah, that's a
continued to
problem.
requisition grain, not knowing the full extent.
That's a problem that like communism has historically really struggled with. Back in the day, especially before computers and stuff. Like, well, and I guess this is more a human issue of like lying to curry favor with the Communist Party. I would assume that you would need to be punished pretty severely if you were going to try to organize your state this way, especially before like computers and like monitoring and all that sort of stuff is invented. Like you would need to punish anybody who lies about their productive capabilities pretty severely because otherwise it throws off everything else.
Devastation at the ground level. The third and perhaps most significant contributing factor was the lack of bureaucratic oversight. The state bureaucracy created under the Communist Party was still in its infancy by the time of the Great Leap, and many subtle organizational deficiencies still needed to be worked out. Higher level officials failed to identify the discrepancy between the figures in reports and the actual quantity of grain being collected. They also failed to keep tabs or discipline lower level cadres to correct the deviations in their reporting.
See, that's what I was saying. They needed to punish those people. You can't be doing that. If they don't have ways of verifying themselves, if the leadership doesn't have ways of verifying themselves, then you got to punish the people who lie make sure that they stop doing that.
Lower level cadres also failed to report emergency conditions to higher level officials in fear of losing their post or status in the party.
Or alternatively, like reward significantly the people who report accurately.
The disaster caused by the Great Leap Forward, conservative elements within the party sought to restore order and stability and maintain that strengthening the party bureaucracy was the principal measure that would prevent the occurrence of another major crisis. Mao agreed with the necessity of returning to stable conditions, but he was troubled by the right-wing turn towards bureaucratization that the party was taking in order to achieve its goals, fearing that it would undermine the revolutionary agency of the masses. He was also troubled by the trend of dismantling many of the rural social services introduced under the Great Leap Forward. Educational reforms were reversed, and state services like healthcare became heavily skewed towards urban areas. Mao always argued that a medical system based on highly specialized professionals working towards reaching the pinnacle of their field did not benefit the peasantry, and that the party should instead focus on providing...
As someone who lives in America, I can assure you that that is the case.
greater access.
Our medical system is very geared towards highly technical and, doctors and stuff who make absurd amounts of money that then cost is then just passed off entirely onto the people who like just need, I don't know, like like some stitches or something, you know? Like it's definitely I kind of agree with Mao on that one.
Access to basic care, such as the provision of mosquito nets. In the face of the growing party bureaucracy, Mao's confidence in China's revolutionary path began to falter, and his once optimistic view of molding history to revolutionary
Oh,
ideals
he's so
now gave
sad
way
now.
to a darker, more pessimistic outlook. He condemned the new bureaucratic class emerging within the party and the socio-economic policies it pursued, fearing it would lead China away from the socialist road and down the capitalist road. He complained that the party treated him like a dead ancestor and that Deng has not consulted me on anything. He
Yeah,
became
I mean, I
increasingly
think he became a sort of relegated, like a figurehead type person with little power, at least by this point. I remember seeing that in another video.
concerned with the party's right-wing turn, as well as the growing problem of corrupt officials, but his complaints largely fell on deaf ears. While he retired from party activities, he refused to accept a diminished influence, remain sidelined, or be relegated to a merely symbolic role.
Yep.
In political isolation, Mao began formulating a political strategy that would steer the People's Republic back onto the socialist road. As the problems of the Great Leap Forward had become generally known, Mao became the target of increased scrutiny by the party as well as the general public. In 1962, the historian and deputy mayor of Beijing, Wu Han, produced a play called Hai Rui Dismissed from Office. The play reenacted a political drama that took place under the Ming Dynasty, where a loyal and dedicated public servant, Hai, carries out the complaints of the people to the emperor at the expense of his career. The emperor becomes so offended when Hai criticizes him for tolerating corruption and abuses of power that he dismisses him from his post. Hai is only later rehabilitated after the death of the emperor. The play used a mixture of traditional and modern themes to criticize the tyrannical overreach of the Ming government, which many interpreted as a thinly veiled attack on Mao and the failed policies of the Great Leap Forward.
Yeah, I would
Despite having
interpret
become
it
the
that way
target
too.
of possible criticism, Mao was intrigued by the debates that erupted in response to Wu's play, and sought to further encourage intellectual discussion to provide feedback for the party on how to improve and meet the needs of the people. He continued to believe that it was necessary to allow intellectual discussion to flourish in order for the people to express their will and guide the direction of the party. However, much of the discussion that emerged demonstrated a lack of understanding surrounding socialist values and principles. Mao became critical of the education system for teaching theory without revolutionary practice, and denounced the many attempts to synthesize Mao Zedong thought with traditional Chinese philosophy such as Confucianism. Therefore, in 1962, motivated by the need to maintain the revolutionary spirit of the masses,
Someday I want to go to China. I think it would be really fun. One of my best buddies is from, or his parents were from China. I think he has some family out there, but yeah, I would love to go see what China's all about.
Mao emerged from political seclusion to launch the socialist education movement, which called for a mass struggle against two prevailing capitalist tendencies within the party: revisionism and bureaucratism. Sidestepping the party bureaucracy, Mao looked to the People's Liberation Army as a bastion of revolutionary values and a tool to combat party conservatism. The People's Liberation Army's 1964 Learn from the PLA campaign emphasized Maoist virtues such as the love of humans over material things, the importance of ideological purity,
I
the
agree with that.
primacy of political work, and the necessity of integrating theory with practice.
Hey, all sounds good to me.
The
Let's see
Learn
where it
from the
goes wrong.
PLA campaign began the initial stages of elevating Mao's stature into a cult of personality by ubiquitously spreading his portraits and praise in PLA literature and artwork. The socialist education movement mobilized 3.5 million people, including higher level officials, cadres, young people, and students, from urban centers to rural areas
By
in
the way,
order.
all this stuff is happening over in China. Like, how many Americans know any of this stuff, though? Like, this is very important history, I think. Like about like one of the biggest countries like in the world, if not the biggest, I guess. uh, in terms of like population, I think. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but like this is like we should know this stuff. This is very important, especially considering how much we're taught to hate China and how we're inevitably going to go to war with them or whatever, which like okay. I think it's pretty obvious at this point that America could not stand a war against China. But like I don't know. I wish that people I wish that we were taught more about this stuff in like school or whatever. Like we don't need to, I guess, be taught every single country's like major historical developments or whatever, because there's a lot of countries and there's a lot of history out there. But some of the, like we learn about the Cold War, we learn about all of that stuff from America's perspective. But I do wish that we learn more about like uh, just the development of these other countries into what they are today. I mean, I think it would be important, especially for people to not have such a like I don't know. I guess maybe that's why we don't learn it, but like such reactionary tendencies towards these states that we have deemed our enemies or whatever. Like this is very interesting stuff.
To investigate local relationships and learn about rural conditions. The campaign aimed to purify politics, purify
Keep it
economics,
pure.
purify the organization, and purify
Oof.
thought.
You
By
gotta be
rooting
careful though with that language. Whenever you hear someone talking about purification, like it's usually pretty bad. It's usually more like purifying our country, purifying, yeah, like you gotta be careful with that language.
out corrupt officials and empowering lower levels of the peasantry. However, despite Mao's best
Because
efforts,
usually they're not targeting the bureaucrats and the elites when they say words like that. Usually when they're talking about purification, it's usually certain groups of people that people aren't very fond of in the country that they're living in, like is what they're usually talking about.
the socialist education movement resulted in only minor reforms, and the rightists still held the greatest influence and control within the party
Rightist.
bureaucracy.
We gotta bring back that term as well. Rightist is, I think, a very like a good word to describe a lot of people. That like if we can get more negative, some more stank on that word in modern society, I think that could be good.
However, the movement did prepare the ideological battleground for a much larger campaign known as the Great Proletarian Cultural
Look at that
Revolution.
guy. See, he's gonna protect us. Look at how wide he is. Wide with a D, not white. He's not white, but yeah, he will protect us. He will protect the revolution. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, 66 to 76.
In the summer of 1966, at the age of 72, in a dramatic attempt to arouse revolutionary sentiment within the masses, cleanse China of its traditional culture, purge revisionist and bureaucratic elements from the party, and reposition himself at the center of state power, Mao orchestrated the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. At the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, Yao Wenwan published an article criticizing Wuhan's play, claiming that the play was actually a sympathetic portrayal of Peng Dehuai's reformist efforts, and thus an attack on Chairman Mao and the Great Leap Forward. The article is often cited as the spark that launched the Cultural Revolution and elevated the Gang of Four within the party, including
Gang of Four.
Yao, Jiang Chengchao, Wang Hongwen, and the leading figure, Mao's former wife, Jiang Qing.
The Gang of Four. Wow.
In May 1966, Mao made
His
the
former
dramatic
wife
declaration.
being involved. That's yeah. I mean that's kind of cool. That's I think the first woman figure that they've talked about in this revolution.
That to rebel is justified, and called on young people and students to bombard the party headquarters. Students at Peking University posted a manifesto denouncing their university president for suppressing discussions of the Wuhan plague.
Look at these. This is where they got a. Oh man, they did go a little. They went a little crazy here. When you got like 12-year-olds out like, championing the cause of the revolution or whatever. Um, yeah, maybe we can put like you got to be at least 16 to go out and start like dictating struggle sessions to your professors.
The demonstration sparked widespread student protests across the country, with student groups rallying under Mao's slogans of justified rebellion and destruction before construction. There was a sharp escalation of outright condemnation and even violence towards corrupt party officials, and a rightist purge commenced with Mao successfully re-establishing his personal influence within the party.
The rebrand. Wow, punched him. Wow. Completely smashed the capitalist class in the reactionary line of Liu and Deng. Yeah, so it seems like people were getting pretty
Liu was
mad at,
purged.
Liu and Deng. I'm very bad with English names already, so I'm gonna be even worse with Chinese names. So
Publicly humiliated, and eventually imprisoned, where he succumbed to complications arising from diabetes. Deng, on the other hand, was
Deng.
purged and exiled to the countryside to perform farm labor. At the ground level, over 12 million young people formed into Red Guards and marched throughout the cities and the countryside, targeting the four olds: old culture, old customs, old habits, and old ideas.
The only thing I really know about this is is what I've read. Well, I've seen some. I mean, I've watched some YouTube videos on the Cultural Revolution, but I've read and oh God, what's that book called? The Three Body Problem or whatever, with the lady who has her parents essentially get struggle session, potentially to death, if I remember correctly, at the beginning of the book. Um, and then she gets sent out to the countryside to do to talk to talk to aliens and shit. That's a good book though. If people haven't read Three Body Problem, I really liked it. It's like a nice blend of it's a blend of like science and art, like in a way that I really like. Like they have these very like scientific concepts that they express through like this really like artistic visual that I don't know. I enjoyed it a lot. Anyway, I don't know why I started talking the Cultural Revolution, right? Okay, we're back.
The Red Guards destroyed symbols and cultural artifacts of the old order, renamed streets with revolutionary names, and humiliated those with bourgeois appearances or behaviors. 114,000 homes were invaded and ransacked, while foreign currency, gold, and other valuables worth 44.8 million Chinese yuan were confiscated. They burned 2.3 million books and 3.3 million paintings,
Yeah.
art objects, and pieces of furniture.
So, because my understanding is that like this went a little bit like crazy. It ended up being like a lot of people just attacking their the professors they didn't like, just calling them bourgeois or whatever. It ended up putting like taking almost anything intellectual at all a lot of times got kind of like deemed like counter-revolutionary and stuff, and it just went, the excesses. A lot of times it happens in revolution. It's kind of just a part. No revolution is perfect, so
In an all out attempt to destroy every remnant of traditional Chinese culture. Mao promoted his philosophy
the
and
little
vision
red
for the
book.
Cultural Revolution through the mass produced book Quotations of Chairman Mao Zedong, which was carried and closely studied by every member of the Red Guard as well as many Chinese citizens. The Little Red Book, as it came to be known, was the single most visible icon throughout the Cultural Revolution. In posters and pictures, nearly every painted character, whether smiling or looking determined, was seen with a copy of the book in his or her hand.
They look determined. They look smiley. Oh, that dude riding that tractor was so happy. He was like, "Do you see this little red book? Look at this thing. This thing's awesome."
The contents of the Little Red Book reiterated a definition of class struggle at 3 different levels. Mao argued that class struggle occurred between socialist and capitalist countries, within countries between reactionaries and the people, as well as within the people between socialist roaders and rightists with bourgeois ideas, appearances, or behaviors. Within this new ideological climate, intellectuals became particularly vulnerable, facing indiscriminate attacks from all sides. Initially, Red Guards and student organizations led an assault on intellectuals from bad backgrounds, as well as the sons and daughters of the former bourgeoisie. But the movement soon escalated from targeting the four olds to purging party officials and intellectuals. The ongoing destruction and violence perpetrated by the Red Guards led to the creation of opposition student and worker groups, as well as violent outbursts in specific localities. The most violent escalations occurred in the province of Guangxi, where several massacres took place through the fall of 1967, as well as the spring and summer of 1968. Pre-existing political divisions erupted into open hostilities as armed conflict emerged between the military and left-wing rebel factions. An investigation by the Communist Party found that over 100,000 people had been killed in the violence, and according to some accounts, indiscriminate murder and even cannibalism became common. By 1968, the People's Liberation Army was being called on to suppress revolutionary uprisings, and in the cities, the Cultural Revolution went into a sharp decline. However, the campaign was largely extended to the countryside to reinvigorate many of the key social programs that were introduced under the Great Leap Forward. The most significant and economically successful of the new rural policies of the Cultural Revolution was the regeneration of the program to build industrial enterprises. The program of rural industrialization was part of a larger design to achieve local socio-economic self-sufficiency in rural areas and to narrow the gap between the town and countryside. Urban assistance to the countryside came in the form of urban technicians, scientists, and individual managers to work in rural areas. It also included the dissemination of technical knowledge through the provision of books and teaching, and the training of rural people in urban factories and schools. Much of this new technical expertise was largely introduced to prepare agricultural production for the integration of tractors, which had more than doubled in production between 1970 to 1976.
I don't know what we need in America, to be honest. We need something like this, though. We need a way for, city folk like me. Wait, why'd I put on the rural accent? Never mind. City folk like me to go get more involved in uh, rural communities, and ways for rural people to get more like integrated to some extent with their nearby cities. I think that in America, it's like these city versus non-city like fights are there's so much animosity. Like everybody hates everybody else. So the people in the city a lot of times think down upon a lot the people who don't live in the city, and the people who live out in the middle of nowhere think fuck city people, like they suck or whatever. And it's also, very partisan in terms of our political dynamics in this country. And there's obviously no desire by the capitalists or by the elites to actually, get us not at each other's throats or whatever. But if someone came along and really united everybody along class, people like me who are just programmers who do work, live in the city or whatever, are no different than people like you who are, I don't know, running your local farm or whatever. We're all contributing labor. I don't know. I think there's a lot that we could really learn from some of these initiatives that they did here. Of
Dramatic
course, that would take a concerted effort by our government to actually try to fix the divisions of this country instead of actively stoke them, which, not holding my breath on that one.
efforts were also made to re-establish healthcare access to the peasantry. The entire national healthcare system was radically decentralized once again, with doctors and mobile medical teams dispatched to the countryside, with all city medical personnel required to serve on such teams on a rotating basis. Meanwhile, new classes provided education to rural barefoot doctors who lacked formal education but possessed a wealth of practical knowledge and experience. These barefoot doctors not only received practical training, but also education for a professional medical career, with many later finding employment in the cities. The Cultural Revolution generally sought to divert political
Dude, their
power from the
forearms are
party
huge.
bureaucracy back to
These
the
these dudes never skip forearm day. They have a day dedicated to forearms. Like some people do, you know, chest day, back day, leg day. These dudes do forearm day, and they hit it like 3 times a week. Okay, like this insane.
control of the people. It caused great social instability, but it was also a movement that was carried out from below for the purposes of benefiting the people. Many achievements were made under the movement, including the establishment of an urban people's commune in Shanghai. But for the most part, the movement ushered in unnecessary confusion, chaos, and violence. It was no longer safe to openly criticize Mao without being labeled a counter-revolutionary. Even Mao's closest ally, Lin Biao, was shockingly condemned as a traitor after he died in a plane crash.
Hmm,
For now, the party
interesting.
bureaucracy would need to hide its capacity and bide its time, and simply wait for the emperor to pass away before being allowed to once again bring a semblance of order and stability to the chaos born under Mao.
Chaos. The death of Mao Zedong, 1976.
When it was announced that Mao Zedong had passed away on September 9th, 1976, the news was met with an outpouring of grief from across the nation. Throughout his life,
I mean, he's a
Mao
huge
often
figure.
appeared or was presented as an invincible force of history. Like many of his closest comrades, he escaped innumerable close calls with death throughout decades of revolutionary and civil
Wow.
war. He emerged as China's ultimate embodiment of revolutionary commitment and achievement.
I will say this: the hair, not a fan. I'm sorry. I can't I can't get on board with it. I'm just not a fan of that hairstyle. Think you gotta switch it up a little bit. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to say, Matt. Does that make me a counter-revolutionary? Maybe. Maybe. Maybe I renounce leftism entirely because I can't get behind this hairstyle. But Evie, what do you want? Why are you always crying?
And hopes for the future were often directly pinned on his longevity. Mao's embalmed cadaver was draped with the party flag and displayed in the Great Hall of the People for 1 week. His official portrait hung on the wall with a banner reading, "Carry on the cause left by Chairman Mao and carry on the cause of proletarian revolution to the end." Over 1 million people, including diplomatic envoys, leaders of foreign communist parties, and foreign nationals in China, filed past Mao to pay their final respects, with many openly displaying their tears as they gave their final salute. Before Mao's death, party moderates, notably Zhou Enlai, rehabilitated the formerly exiled Deng Xiaoping. With Deng's reintroduction to the party, it became clear that the party bureaucracy was once again seeking recovery from the disaster and confusion caused by the Cultural Revolution. The Gang of Four, who had carried out many of Mao's directives in his old age, were in a secure position to carry on the cause left by Chairman Mao, but Deng Xiaoping's pragmatism and focus on orderly development reigned supreme. After Deng's rehabilitation, the Gang of Four were purged from the party and punished with lengthy prison sentences for their crimes. On the 14th of May 1991, the most prominent and outspoken member of the Gang of Four, Jiang Qing, committed suicide by hanging. Her suicide note revealed the sense of defeat that she felt in the face of the conservative triumph over the radical revolutionaries in the party. Today, the revolution has been stolen by the revisionist clique of Deng, Peng Zhen, and Yang Shangun. Chairman Mao exterminated Liu Shaoqi, but not Deng, and the result of this omission is that unending evils have been unleashed on the Chinese people and nation. Chairman, your student and fighter is coming to see you. The Gang of Four always shot blanket condemnations toward Deng and Liu Shaoqi, but in reality, Deng's hostility towards Maoism was not as sharp as the Gang of Four made it out to seem.
Hmm.
Deng always upheld Mao's legacy, repeated his slogan of seeking truth from fact, and revived his philosophy of development, which focused on engaging a long march of 10,000 li down the socialist road. In
Well,
1981,
that's
he
evidence
said
also
that
by they didn't disavow Mao. Like Mao is still a revered figure, or at least imagery used by the CCP of today. Um, and I think that they potentially like yeah at the end I think they were really like getting tired of Mao, you know, constantly spurring on like 12-year-olds to pick up arms against their high school professor or teacher or whatever, you know, um but in the end, I think they kind of he was an incredibly important figure to getting China from their 100-year humiliation or whatever to where they are today. And I assume that's why most of the people still, to some extent, like respect him a significant amount.
Chairman Mao dedicated most of his life to China. He saved the party and the revolution in their most critical moments. His contribution was so great that without him, the Chinese people would have had a much harder time finding the right path out of the darkness. We also shouldn't forget that it was Chairman Mao who combined the teachings of Marx and Lenin with the realities of Chinese history. It was he who applied those principles creatively, not only to politics but to philosophy, art, literature, and military strategy. We will never do to Mao what Khrushchev did to Stalin.
Yeah, yeah.
The Deng era of reform and opening up,
Like these are all
initiated
just
in
historical figures. They don't have to be deities, they don't have to be demons. Like they can all live in the historical context that they lived in, and we can appreciate things about them like in some respects, and we can say, maybe they shouldn't have done that in other respects. They're just people who have we live through history. We're surrounded by people. Nobody is pure good. Nobody is pure evil, despite what propaganda you're taught in America.
1978 marked the introduction of market socialism and strengthened relations with the capitalist West. The new era under Deng Xiaoping's paramount leadership now emphasized economic criteria over ideological purity and stable development over radical social experiments such as the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural
Moderating.
Revolution. These radical social experiments were discarded in favor of stability and keeping the specter of famine at bay. The question of whether socialist ideals would endure remained uncertain at the time. Many critics echoed the concerns expressed by Mao and the
I
Gang of
would have
Four,
too.
fearing that
I
Deng's
think I would have been very concerned. I think I would have thought that it's over, like the capitalists won, like get ready to lose your health care, everybody. Like, so I'm actually a little bit genuinely surprised that it didn't necessarily like so capitalism obviously is like alive and well inside of China, but they still have always maintained strict and total control of the capital by the government, which is like very impressive and um, like definitely why they're able to outproduce us and able to, you know, create like these cities so quickly and like urbanize so fast and develop so much infrastructure and fix the mundane problems of the working class like so fast. Like I think that the fact that they were able to maintain their communist vision even while allowing some capital, there must be like it just must it kind of shows the staying power and the actual um like of the ideals of like Mao and these figures that they kept all of that and it still persists to this day to an extent.
pragmatism would lead China on the road to capitalism. But Deng always insisted that reform and opening up was designed to maintain China's long march on the socialist road.
Hey, you know, we'll see. China's a state capitalist country right now. Maybe one day once America isn't around to fuck with everybody, maybe they'll be able to transition from state capital to socialist. When you have the entire system completely dependent on America's concepts of global capitalism, and America is willing to risk life and limb like to all of their resources, like America is willing to do whatever it takes to destabilize any non-capitalist country into oblivion. The fact that they still are able to maintain some semblance of control over their capitalists is very impressive. I can't wait to see a world where socialism is allowed to just grow naturally, and not have to be like a constant, like be like just a bulwark against capitalism, like to just be able to see socialist states just rise and not be fucked with like 24/7. I don't know. It'll be cool. I hope I get to see it in my lifetime, but you know, you never know. Like, yeah, the future's yet to be written. So, anyway, that was an interesting video. I hope I added at least a little bit of commentary. This was supposed to be a more educational stream, just learning some stuff, getting big brained. We don't want to just always be laughing at funny YouTube videos, even though I do enjoy doing that. we we should also take some time to uh, gather more knowledge. And so hopefully, if anybody listens to this, they will gain that knowledge as well. Yeah, I think tomorrow we'll go back to a, 4 or 5-ish o'clock stream. Um, Keep it going. We'll probably do more news. We'll probably maybe have a fun video or two. And yeah, well, if anyone's watching, thank you for watching. I had the viewers hidden this time, because I don't really, sometimes I don't like seeing that there's other people watching because it makes me nervous. So, I'm just kind of keeping the viewers hidden. And uh, you know, stay strong, go learn things, be brave in your convictions. If you, learn from history.